Okay, good morning, everyone. I think it's just a minute after 9. I think we still have some people joining, but we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning and welcome to our bonus Brunch and Learn for October. We typically don't do a Brunch and Learn in October because we have, in a few short weeks, we have our new member seminar, school law seminar, and annual convention where we hope to see all of you there. But we have, a lot of important issues coming up here in the upcoming November election. One of which is Measure 4. And so we wanted to take the time to pass on some additional information about Measure 4 to our members so that you all are informed and can anticipate potential impacts should Measure 4 be approved in November. Also on the line with me is Taylor Lassiter from our office. Her and I will walk through this and answer any questions that you have. Please feel free to answer questions as we go along. You can use the Q&A feature on your Zoom bar at mine's at the top, but yours is probably at the bottom of your toolbar for Q&A. With that, let's go ahead and get started. If you have any technical issues, feel free to alert us to those in the chat box, and we'll try to address those as we go along. Okay, so I'm sure most of you have probably, or at least I hope all of you have at least heard of Measure 4 and are somewhat aware of what it is and the potential impact that it has on public education in North Dakota. But we wanted to make sure that everyone is adequately informed. You guys all might be receiving questions from your patrons, parents, maybe your staff, or whatever the case may be. So essentially what Measure 4 is, it's an initiated measure that is on the ballot in November for the November 5th election coming up. And just from a very simple standpoint, it seeks to abolish property taxes in North Dakota. It seeks to eliminate the ability of local governments like school districts from levying taxes based on the assessed value of property. Former state legislator Rick Becker is the chair of the sponsoring committee that's behind the measure. You've maybe heard him, over the last several months out and about talking about it. But he leads the group that brought the measure and circulated the petition to get the measure on the ballot. As I said, it seeks to abolish the ability of local governments to levy taxes based on the assessed value of property. Local governments include public school districts, cities, counties, park districts, and townships. If the measure is passed, it would become effective on January 1st, 2025. So here is the text of the measure. You may have seen this. This is available on the North Dakota Secretary of State's website. We have actually 5 different ballot measures that are on the statewide ballot this year. And that's a lot of measures on one ballot. And this is Measure 4. And essentially, I've highlighted kind of the core language of the measure, but we're gonna unpack it just a bit. Okay, so like I said, the measure seeks to essentially it provides that local governments would not be able to levy any tax on the assessed value of property, and that's what we know as property taxes. That's when people talk about property taxes, this is what they're talking about. Property taxes are levied at the local level by local governments like school districts, cities, counties, park districts, as I mentioned. That's what the main thrust of this Measure 4 is, to eliminate the ability of local governments to levy taxes. It does exclude taxes that are levied for the payment of bonded indebtedness if that is incurred before the bonded indebtedness is incurred before the end of a 30-day period following the date the measure is approved until the debt is paid. So what does that mean? So essentially, you would have to have issued the bonded indebtedness and incurred the indebtedness no later than 30 days following the approval of the ballot measure. So the ballot or the measure is on the ballot in the election on November 5th. And so 30 days after that, should the measure be approved, that would be the cutoff date for taxes that are levied for the payment of bonded indebtedness incurred before that date. So if we have school districts that had a bond referendum on the ballot in June at their regular election, and that bond was approved by the voters, you could still levy taxes to pay for that bonded indebtedness until that debt is fully paid, and then those levies would drop off and you would no longer be approved or able to levy taxes based on the assessed value of property in your district. The measure also requires that the state is required to make annual payments to replace the revenue generated from those levies in an amount no less than the taxes levied during the 2024 calendar year. This part of the measure caused some confusion initially. We weren't sure if that meant that it was the actual taxes that were paid during the 2024 calendar year, or the taxes that are essentially based on your certificate of levy that you filed this fall, and that would be paid in the 2025 calendar year. I think it's largely agreed at this point that it's the levies that you are probably, well, up until tomorrow, you would be approving those certificates of levy and sending those off to your county auditors. It's those levies that you're levying this year that would be paid in 2025. That is what sets the minimum of those, essentially those replacement payments that the state is required to make to replace the revenue that was generated by those property taxes. In addition, the measure would limit the debt of a political subdivision to an amount not to exceed 2.5% of full and true value of real property. This one is doesn't get as much attention, but basically under the Constitution as it stands right now, local governments, political subdivisions are allowed to have their limit of indebtedness is set at 5% under the Constitution. You are there is provisions in the Century Code that allow you to increase that limit of indebtedness to 10% with voter approval. But so this would decrease that limit of indebtedness. I believe the full and true value of real property is also a difference. I think currently, and I might be wrong about this, the limit of indebtedness is on the assessed value of real property, but I might be wrong about that. If anybody, I just can't recall off the top of my head. But anyway, the measure does seek to decrease the limit of indebtedness for political subdivisions. There are some exceptions in the measure for cities, but obviously that doesn't apply to us as school districts. And then finally, the measure would prevent political subdivisions from issuing general obligation bonds that are secured with taxes levied on the assessed value of property. So this is directly related to those bond measures that districts use often to fund facility improvements or construction. You would not be able to issue those general obligation bonds when they're secured by taxes levied, when they're secured by property taxes, essentially. So these are kind of the main points of Measure 4 that I've highlighted here in the measure language. So why does this all matter to us? as you all know, property taxes, and as I mentioned before, property taxes are collected by local governments. They're levied and collected at the local level by cities, counties, townships, schools, and park districts. The big deal for schools is that approximately 40% of all local property taxes that are levied go to schools. So it's a big portion of, or I shouldn't say a big portion, but a good portion of all property taxes that are levied go to support public education in North Dakota. You know, on average, the state funds about 70% of public education in North Dakota through the per pupil payment and the state aid payment. And then 30% approximately of the remainder of public education comes from local revenue sources and some other sources. So should Measure 4 pass, that's going to, you know, have a significant impact on public education funding in North Dakota. And so for us, it's a big, it could potentially have a big impact. In addition to supporting public and funding public education in North Dakota, it also funds public safety measures, including our county sheriff, our local police departments, jails. Don't know what FAIR means. I'm that must be a typo. Ambulance services, corrections, and 911 or 911, excuse me, dispatch. FAIR should be fire. I apologize. Our local fire departments are also funded in part by local property taxes. In addition to that, local property taxes help support public works like roads, bridges, snow removal, water, and waste collection and disposal. And then finally, they also fund community services such as parks, campgrounds, recreational facilities, local public libraries, senior transportation and meal services, and also public health. So as you can see, local property taxes collected by local governments fund a variety of important services that are provided, you know, by these local governments, including K-12 public education. So it's a big deal. It could have a significant impact on how we essentially provide our services at the local government level. Okay, so this is a graph that was created by the Association of Counties, just giving us an idea of where property taxes go in North Dakota. So this kind of reinforces what I was saying about, you can see here a larger part of the pie, 41% goes to schools in North Dakota. Another large chunk goes to cities and counties, and then townships, and then some other miscellaneous. So, you know, I believe these are 2023 numbers, but I don't know that off the top of my head, but I believe they're 2023 numbers. I don't know, Taylor, if you know that off the top of your head, but essentially
I think it was between 2021, 2023.
Okay. But a total of $1.4 billion in property taxes were collected. And this is how they're divvied up. So it's a significant funding source for all of these local governments. And then this graph shows where property taxes come from in North Dakota. So a large chunk comes from residential property owners, 36%, or about, you know, just over a third. About 18% come from agricultural property. And then another thing that's interesting about this graph is about 26% comes from commercial or for-profit businesses. And so if property taxes are eliminated, one of the potential impacts is that, you know, those for-profit businesses, you know, may not be paying as much of a share of the, you know, of the pie to support those local services and local governments. And so that's something, another impact to keep in mind. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit more about what this means for schools in particular. And I think it's important to kind of really, you know, uh, get down to the details in terms of what this really means. I think we talk about, I think a lot of people, when they think about eliminating property taxes, I mean, it's a significant portion of owning property in North Dakota, especially for homeowners. It's I think everybody would love to not pay their taxes. It can be a significant chunk of your income going to property taxes, and it can sometimes make property unaffordable for some folks in North Dakota and across the country. But I think what the other side of it is to know, okay, what do property taxes support? And from a school public education standpoint, if Measure 4 were to pass, essentially it would, all of the tax levies that are permitted, specifically in Section 57, 15, 14.2, would go away. So that means your general fund levy, your miscellaneous levy, your sinking and interest levy, special reserve fund levy, tuition levy, safety plan levy, all of those would go away. You also have the ability to levy taxes to pay judgments if you have a judgment that's been issued against the school district. And then also if school districts also who own property also have special assessments that they must pay too, and there is an ability to levy taxes on the assessed value of property to pay those special assessments. So that would go away as well. If so that's what it really means. And there's a lot of, that's what makes up that essentially that 30% of local share. And again, that's an average across the state. That'll vary from district to district, but approximately 30% of there is the local share for funding public education in North Dakota. And without the ability to levy property taxes, that local share for school districts really becomes extremely limited. You also, the levy for your building fund, that's addressed in Section 57, 15, 16, that would go away as well. As I mentioned, you wouldn't be able to issue general obligation bonds that are secured by the assessed value of property. That would go away as well. You do have the ability to issue building fund bonds secured by your building fund levy under Section 210307. Currently, you have that ability. I'm not sure how often that tool is used, but you do have the ability to secure issued building fund bonds secured by your building fund levy currently. I believe that would go away as well because it's bonds that are secured by a property tax levy. There's also another funding or another financing method, certificates of indebtedness. I believe to the extent certificates of indebtedness are secured by uncollected taxes, that ability would go away as well. I don't proclaim to be an expert on school district funding and financing. It can be quite complex. But my understanding of that tool and the measure language would go away as well. So as you can see, this would gut a large portion of chapter 5715, because that is where taxing authority is addressed in the Century Code, not just for school districts, but also for those other local government entities that have taxing authority, like cities, counties, park districts, and townships. So essentially, one impact of Measure 4 would be to gut 5715. And so, we do have a legislative session coming up starting in January of 2025. And so the legislature would have to deal with all of those impacts throughout the Century Code. They would have to address that during session, in addition to trying to figure out where the source of those replacement payments would come from, which I'll address here on the next slide. So as I stated before, the measure would provide that the North Dakota legislature is required to make replacement payments that are at least equal to the amounts levied in 2024. So whatever taxes are on those certificates of levy that are approved by school districts and other local governments this year and then paid by taxpayers in 2025, that is essentially the basement or the floor that in terms of revenue that the legislature would have to replace. The tax department, the North Dakota Tax Department, has estimated that the cost of the plan is approximately 3.15 billion during just this next biennium. So from 2025 to 2027, the cost of those replacement payments would equal roughly 3.15 billion. So a significant financial impact on the state should Measure 4 pass. The measure itself does not identify a source for those revenue payments, those replacement revenue payments. And so that would be up to the state legislature to determine where those funds would come from. So the local governments, other local governments would also, need to figure out how do we replace that local share of revenue to continue to provide the services that we provide. In terms of public education, the state constitution requires that the state provide a free public education for all school-age children in North Dakota. So we don't have the ability to cut the provision of education. I mean, that is a constitutionally required public education system. Obviously, like other local governments, school districts may need to, if Measure 4 were to pass, they may need to look at cutting expenses in addition to trying to figure out other sources of revenue to replace that local share. So local governments will not only be worried about or looking to replace that revenue, but also potentially cutting services, in the event sufficient revenue cannot be gained to replace the local share that is lost. Unlike some other local governments, school districts have very limited ability to generate revenue locally outside of property taxes. And so that's one of the I don't know if it's entirely unique, because other local governments, non-school district local governments are also limited outside of property taxes, but counties and cities have the ability to charge fees. In certain circumstances, school districts can have the ability or the authority to charge student fees under limited circumstances, but obviously it's very limited. We also have the ability to charge for public or for transportation, for student transportation, but that is not often something that school districts do, but that might be something that, depending on the full impact going into the future, charging for student school transportation might be something that school districts who haven't been doing that will need to look at in order to continue to provide that service. So, as we think about, the potential impact of Measure 4, these are all of the things that we've been thinking about as an association on what this could mean going forward should Measure 4 pass. So in terms of where the source of these replacement payments that are required to be made up by the state should Measure 4 pass, there's been a lot of talk about using the legacy fund to make up those revenue payments that are generated by property tax levies. there's a couple of things that we've heard in terms of, why that option may not seem as easy as some folks think. Um, I think many agree that, using the legacy fund long term to replace property tax revenue may require an amendment to the Constitution itself, because the North Dakota Constitution outlines specific guidelines for use and management of the fund. And so depending on how the legacy fund would need to be used in order to make those replacement payments, it could require an amendment to the Constitution itself in order to do that. It's estimated that if the legacy fund were to be used to fully make those replacement payments, that it could burn out or be depleted in approximately 7 years. Now, that's going to depend on other factors that I don't want to get too far into the weeds on, but how the fund performs investment wise and all of that, or additional contributions to the fund due to oil and gas production in the state. All of those are factors that can vary depending on the market and all of those things. And so, but that is kind of an estimate that has been put out there in terms of what impact it could have on the legacy fund going forward. The other thing with respect to the legacy fund is the principal earnings for the fund are already allocated to support other state needs. So I think there is this idea that the legacy fund is just sitting there and not being used, but that's not the case. The legacy fund is being used to support other state needs, including, for example, the highway distribution fund. So it is already allocated to other uses already. So it would need to, if it were used to make these replacement payments, that would have to be a consideration as well for the state legislature. And then, as I stated before, this, I think we've been largely fortunate to have the legacy fund grow in the way that it has. But that stability depends largely on its investment performance, which can be unpredictable and may not, it's not a guaranteed sufficient revenue source for the long term to replace that property tax funding that we're getting. So that's just a couple of things that I think if Measure 4 were to pass, the state legislature would be looking at in terms of, okay, is the legacy fund a sufficient source to then make these replacement payments should Measure 4 pass? Okay, so a couple of other potential impacts that I wanted to just mention that, us education stakeholders have been kind of chatting about and trying to come up with some considerations for. So if Measure 4 were to pass, again, the state would then be, the entire burden, essentially, of funding, almost the entire burden of funding local government services would go to the state. And so one of the concerns or one of the potential impacts is that there would then create this disparity between urban and rural legislative districts. Urban districts who have larger population centers have more representation at the state level compared to some rural districts. And so would that create disparities just overall between urban and rural legislative districts? Just simply because, larger legislative districts, larger in terms of population, have more representation at the state level. So that's something that we all have been thinking about. In terms of education itself, we often, when the state legislature was creating the school funding formula to fund the per pupil payment, one of the things that was talked about and the kind of one of the policies behind the funding formula is equity and adequacy in education throughout the state. So no matter where a student resides, the funding formula is to provide an adequate education as well as an equitable education, no matter where that student lives. I think there is some concern about if Measure 4 were to pass, how would that impact equity and adequacy in providing a public education throughout the state. The other thing that Measure 4 doesn't identify or expressly consider in its language is what happens when there's fluctuations in enrollments or rising costs or budgetary changes over time in local governments. Specifically for school districts, when we have a rapid enrollment increases, which, there are several districts throughout North Dakota over the last, well, I guess forever, have, we've seen spikes in enrollments when we've had, industry come in, and that brings in, creates a lot of available employment opportunities. And so we have folks moving into those areas and causing, rapid enrollment increases. Measure 4 doesn't account for that in terms of the replacement payments. It just sets that floor at the 2024 levels. And then essentially it would be up to the state legislature whether to fund and how to fund to account for those fluctuations that happen. So, school districts and other local governments, Measure 4 doesn't do anything to limit budgets. In particular, you'd still have the ability to approve your budgets at the local level, but the funding of those budgets is what's limited by Measure 4. And so that's the impact on budgets. And Taylor, you feel free to jump in whenever you feel like you need to add anything.
You're covering everything.
I'm kind of cruising through here. Yeah, and that's what I mean by decrease in local control of budgets. Yes, we would still have the ability as local governments to approve our budgets and to set our budgets. Measure 4 doesn't impact that, but it's the funding part of our budgets that Measure 4 would impact. The other thing is, like I mentioned, local governments, including school districts, may have to, going forward, especially into the future, without setting that floor, without any guarantee that the state would fund for increases in costs and those fluctuations, it could lead to a decline in services, and particularly in infrastructure and facility maintenance and improvement and construction. Property taxes, the levying of property taxes in large part support our maintenance of our infrastructure and our facilities at the local level. And so without that funding source, I think there is a concern that would that result in a decline in services or the status of our infrastructure and our facilities at the local level. Okay, so that in a nutshell is kind of Measure 4 and some of the more detailed information about what it is, the impacts it would have on local government, how things would change should Measure 4 pass in November. But one of the things we wanted to, obviously this is something that has been on the minds of school officials, since we were alerted that another effort to abolish property taxes was a petition was circling the state. So it's something that we've all been, watchful of and following very closely. And as we approach the November election, not knowing, if it passes, exactly what that will look like, and particularly what our legislative session will look like in 2025. And so I think a lot of school officials have wanted to educate folks in their districts about Measure 4 so that they're informed when they go to vote in November. And one of the things that we've want all of our members and their staff and their leadership to be mindful of is the limitations and the prohibitions in that the North Dakota Corrupt Practices Act sets in terms of local political subdivisions engaging in political activities. So North Dakota law, specifically in Chapter 16.1-10 of the Century Code, prohibits using school district property or services for political purposes. It covers other local governments, other political subdivisions as well, but one of those is school district as well. So we're going to talk about how this impacts school districts in particular. So what does it mean? What does political purpose mean under the North Dakota Corrupt Practices Act? Essentially, it is defined in Century Code, but essentially it's any activity that supports or opposes a ballot measure or a candidate's election. Any activity that would be in support of or in opposition to a ballot measure or a candidate's election. So that's what we have to be mindful of. School district property includes things like vehicles, telephones, office equipment, so copiers, funds, actual money and assets, buildings, school email addresses and letterhead are also considered school district property for purposes of the Corrupt Practices Act. So again, you cannot use any of those things in any activity that would be seen as supporting or opposing a ballot measure or a candidate's election. Services include the work of employees during their regular hours. So, directing employees to distribute, signs, yard signs that, oppose or support Measure 4, for example, would be a violation of the Corrupt Practices Act. So using your school employees to oppose or support a ballot measure would be a violation of the Corrupt Practices Act. If it's part of their employment duties and responsibilities and it's during their regular working hours. If violations are treated as a Class A misdemeanor, so there are criminal penalties attached to violating the North Dakota Corrupt Practices Act. And I would say, on this measure in particular, I think we want to be very mindful of the how we talk about Measure 4 and how we inform our patrons and our residents of our district and how our staff engage in those discussions, especially during working hours, because I feel like there's a lot of attention is on Measure 4. There's a lot of strong opinions about Measure 4 and whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. And so it's really important to be mindful of the limitations under North Dakota law when we're using school district property and services on a day-to-day basis. So some of the things that you can do, and this is geared a little bit more towards school board members as elected officials. So school board members, for example, are allowed to express their personal opinion as a private citizen. So are employees when they're on their own time, when they're outside of the school environment, when they're not acting in their employment capacity, when school board members are not acting in their capacity as school board members, you have the ability to express your personal opinion as a private citizen. So you can chat with your family members and your friends and acquaintances, that you run into around town. Typically, there's not a problem doing that, right? In addition to that, school districts, school officials, other local government officials are able to provide factual, unbiased information about ballot measures. The information should be neutral and not advocate for or against the measure. North Dakota law expressly allows you to do that for purposes of education and informational purposes. So that's something, I think that's where I think we need to be careful about, making sure that the information that we're providing, it's perfectly appropriate to talk about impacts of a potential measure, but not to then take the next step and encourage people to vote one way or the other. And so how you communicate about the impacts of Measure 4 on public education, for example, you want to make sure that you're aware of these lines so that you don't cross them. Use of public buildings. You can use public buildings. We often, a lot of districts allow for the non-educational use of school buildings. They rent them out to members of the community. And so it's appropriate to continue to allow your public buildings to be used in accordance with your policies, even if that is a yes committee for a measure, for example, using a public building for their meetings, as long as they are using it as in accordance with your policies, just like any other group, and it's available to other a no committee, for example, that's typically fine. So what about some of the things that you can't do? You can't use school resources to support your personal political views. So you shouldn't be using your school email address, your K-12 school email address, to encourage people to go out and vote no on a measure or yes on a measure. That would be, just simply using your school email account, that would be problematic. This is potential. This is we want to make sure our employees and specifically our school leadership and school administration are aware of this, but I think board members fall into this a little bit easier because, oftentimes the school district assigns you a school district email to use for, board business. So if you are going to be, communicating with folks about your views on Measure 4 or any other measure on the ballot, make sure that you're not using your school email address to do that. Obviously, using school resources to advocate for or against the ballot measure. And you don't necessarily have to say vote no or vote yes. Other language that essentially says that can also be considered a violation. So be mindful of the language and what your message is. If your goal is to inform and to educate, make sure that that's what you're doing without encouraging people to vote one way or the other. I don't necessarily see anything wrong with, making sure people are aware how they can vote, where they vote, what the election date is and time, what the poll hours are. I think it's okay to inform people about all of those things and even, encourage them to make their opinion heard. I think that in most instances is okay. But, making sure that you're not leaning or favoring one side or the other in the language that you're using, that's the important part. In terms of school board members, making sure that if you do have these conversations, while you're out and about in the community, a lot of people know that you're a board member. And so making sure that you're making it clear that you're speaking in your own personal capacity. You're not speaking on behalf of the school district or on behalf of your board, that you're not authorized to speak on behalf of your board. That, I think, is an important thing to make clear to folks as well. Okay. We also wanted to provide some resources for additional information should you be interested in that. The North Dakota Secretary of State website has all of the ballot measures and have lots of other information about the various ballot measures. As I said, there are 5 on the ballot for the November election, including Measure 4. But there are other measures on there as well. And I think ballot measures in particular, I think, are important to make sure you're getting the information you need to understand before you step into the ballot box or to the voting booth, excuse me, on election day, to make sure you know what you're voting on. Sometimes the ballot language isn't very helpful. I know I've been and, reading a ballot and I'm like, I don't really understand what that says, and I have, years of legal training and sometimes it's not entirely clear. So I think it's great to go out and inform yourself and do your own research on what these ballot measures are about. And the North Dakota Secretary of State's website is a good, I think, first step. There's also the Keep It Local Coalition website that I've listed here. North Dakota School Boards Association is a member of the Keep It Local Coalition. That coalition was formed in opposition to Measure 4. There are, I think, what now, Taylor, 110
I
different
think we're over
coalition
that
members?
number now too. That was,
Yeah,
yeah, newsletter just went out though, yesterday, so I'm sure the updated number is there as well as the updated list of members.
yeah. And it's a broad spectrum of industry and in North Dakota. And so there are, a lot of people are talking about it. A lot of people are interested in how this will all shake out. That's one, if you want to keep updated on what the coalition is doing and the information that it provides, their website is there. We also did an article in our September bulletin about Measure 4, and I've linked that here as well. Another interesting uh, resource for information is the state tax commissioner's presentation that was made to the Legislative Management Committee, this interim. I think it was in late August, if I remember correctly. But what that focused on was the financial impact of Measure 4, as well as some of the other ballot measures. So it's very interesting. It's the state tax commissioner explained how they determined the impact, the fiscal impact of Measure 4 and other measures. And so it's interesting reading if you want to take a look there.
And I would say it's eye-opening to see the kind of work that would go into the upcoming months if the measures were to pass.
Yeah, absolutely. We would have a very busy legislative session. I think we were already anticipating a record
We say that every
legislative.
legislative
We do.
session, but it is
And
true.
it beats it every year, right? But in terms of the number of bills that have been pre-filed, all accounts are that it'll be a record year. So we're already anticipating a very busy, kind of crazy and chaotic legislative session. If Measure 4 were to pass, if Measure 5 were to pass, which is the legalization of marijuana use, recreational use in North Dakota, if those two measures themselves pass, that will put a lot of work on the state legislature just on those measures. So how that will look and whether we'll be able to get everything done in 80 days, I don't know, but it's
Not even
going to be
possible.
it's going to be interesting, right, Taylor?
It
Um,
sure will.
the other thing we wanted to let you know is we do have a few clinic sessions, one on Measure 4 specifically, and then we also have a legislative panel that we'll be having where you'll hear from state legislators on various issues. And I'm sure Measure 4 and elimination of property taxes and property tax reform will all be included in the discussion. Those will be held at our annual convention on October 25th at the Bismarck Event Center. We hope if you are not registered, please go ahead and register now. Taylor, when is the deadline for early bird pricing?
Friday, I'll be sending out another email today, just kind of with a reminder and with the program. The full program is out now, so we'll be sending that out today.
Awesome. I've got a question. If your teacher association uses their own email and sends it to school issued staff emails, is there a problem? So I assume they might be sending out information about Measure 4. I'm not sure if it has, vote no, vote yes, whatever the case may be. I don't think there's anything wrong with receiving emails to your school email account. You don't really have control over that. So if somebody from outside the school is sending emails to you at your school email address with information or even taking a position, either opposing or, supporting a ballot measure, I don't think that is a violation of the Corrupt Practices Act. However, if you then take that email and forward it and then that to somebody, that potentially could be a violation, especially even if it's not your view, if you're passing that information along, that could be a violation. So you want to be really careful about that. And again, a lot of people are being very watchful about what our local government officials are doing, specifically with respect to Measure 4. If you have any questions on the Corrupt Practices Act, what that means, if something that you're doing is, are you, providing information? Are you educating? Where's that line? Feel free to call us at the office here. We would be happy to kind of walk through in more detail what the Corrupt Practices Act, what the limitations are there. Taylor, anything else to add in terms of resources or anything?
Not so much. Just that, within the next week, there will also be a web page up that you can access on our website through our legislative webpage. Just giving some more general information. Our September bulletin will also be attached there. As well as this Brunch and Learn will be up within the next few days. We'll even have some ballot language up as well, just for you to follow, and you can refer back to.
Okay, perfect. Any other questions from any of our attendees? We really appreciate, we have a great number of people on the call today or on the webinar today. So we know people are very interested in Measure 4 and what this will mean for public education, as well as just local government services across the state. So we're very, just being engaged and learning the information is a large part of, I think, being a good citizen and informing yourself before you head to the ballot box on November. So we really appreciate you all taking your time. And I know we provided somewhat short notice, but we thought, well, you know what, let's go ahead and schedule this. And we want to be able to provide information ahead of the election and ahead of a legislative session, frankly, no matter, we will be prepared no matter what happens in November. We'll do what we need to do to address any issues that come up as a result of the November election. Here's our contact information. Should you have any questions, you can call us either at our direct line or at our toll-free line. These are Taylor and my emails. If you have questions specifically about Measure 4, about the clinic sessions, whatever the case may be, either one of us is a good person to contact. And then again, Taylor mentioned we will have additional information on our website as well. So Taylor, unless you have anything else to add, I think that's all the information I have for today. We really appreciate you all. Oh, looks like we might have an additional question here. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thanks, Kelly. Yes. So if you have any questions, need anything going forward, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, we are very excited to see you all at the end of the month at our school law seminar and annual convention. We're at a new venue this year, which we're really excited about being at the event center this year. And we've got some really good programming planned for everyone. So we hope to see all of you there. Please feel free to make sure you register before the end of this week to get that early bird pricing. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Have a good day.